Great. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Becky Fisher. I'm the Chief Exec of the English Association, and I'm so pleased to be here with you this afternoon. Just a quick bit about the EA. The EA is a learner society and a subject association, which was founded in 1906 to promote, support, and defend the discipline of English studies. We cover all stages of education, from primary and early years through to secondary and further education, to higher education and beyond. And we cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers and hosts. So thank you so much to everyone who has given their time so generously to make today happen. Our members of the English Association also make it possible to keep these events free and open to all by paying their membership fees. So if you'd like to be part of the EA and be part of the national conversation about English and help support our discipline, do please consider joining us. It costs just £53 to support our events and campaigning work for a whole year, and you get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all our journals. Today's event is hosted in association with University English and our friends at the Institute for English Studies as well. So that's enough from me. I will now hand over to Linda to get us going. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Becky. Welcome, everyone. It's lovely to see you all here today, and thank you so much for giving up your time to participate in today's event. I'm Linda Pratt, and I'm based at the University of Nottingham, and I'm a member of the English Association's Higher Education Committee. And I'm delighted to be chairing today's session. Today's session is the last in the current Speaking for English series, and Speaking for English is a collaboration between and co-sponsored by the English Association, the IES, and University English. And our focus today is on finding out more about and celebrating REF 2021 case studies that impacted on and helped to shape policy. That's policy very broadly defined. If you pop the search term policy into the REF 2021 impact database for UOA 27, it comes up with 80 hits. And that's about 28.5% of the total number of the 279 impact case studies submitted by English language and literature units for the last REF. Our speakers today provide a wonderful and deeply inspiring, I think, glimpse of how wide-ranging those policy-related interventions by researchers across our discipline actually were. So amongst other things, we're going to hear about how research on Ulster Scots literature has shaped policy in Northern Irish museums, broadcasting, local government and schools, how interdisciplinary research that draws on American studies, critical prison studies, criminology and creative writing has led to new interventions in prison education that have significantly impacted on social inclusion and prisoner reintegration, and how applying and embedding narrative approaches has impacted positively on the development of mental health policies at regional, national and international levels. Today's studies are also, I think, an important and timely reminder of the inherently collaborative and interdisciplinary nature of research and impact in our discipline. And a very, very abbreviated list of the collaborators and partners with whom today's speakers worked includes a Northern Irish Ministerial Advisory Group, Northern Ireland's Council for the Curriculum, Examinations and Assessment, HM Prison Hull, Community Rehabilitation Company and Humber Care, the Sheffield Health and Social Care NHS Trust, and NHS England's Reducing Restraint Strategic Oversight Group. Today provides us with a really useful and important chance to learn more about what our case study authors did and why they did it. It's also an opportunity to celebrate both our achievements in REF 2021 and our disciplines, and indeed I think the arts and humanities more generally, capacity to help shape in multifarious and important ways the world in which we live. And by so doing, I think it's also an opportunity for us to look forward with confidence to REF 2029. So just to very briefly outline the structure of today's event, we have three presentations today. I'm afraid that our fourth speaker, Jeanette Baxter, is unable to join us, but Jeanette has very, very kindly offered to record her presentation, and she's going to do that, and it will be made available on the English Association website in due course. So we'll begin with the presentations, and each will last for around about 10 minutes. We'll then move on to questions, and you're most welcome to pop questions into the chat as we go along, and or to just raise your hand at the end of the presentations. And after the discussion, we'll conclude with a few words from Jenny Richards. So let's begin. So I'd like to begin by introducing our first speaker, Frank Ferguson from the University of Ulster. And Frank is going to tell us more about his fascinating work on enriching the experience of Ulster Scots literature through public outreach, broadcasting, and digital preservation. Frank, over to you.
Thanks very much, Linda, and thank you everybody for the invitation. It's really exciting to hear the range of brilliant work that has been done, and to celebrate the work of the panel here. So it's lovely to be here. I'll begin in many ways, and probably a number of you who are listening are already wondering what Ulster Scots literature actually is. In many ways, it's a very new subject, but it's a subject that is something within Northern Ireland and within Ireland, and indeed the rest of the UK, that is quite pressing in many ways, because it has come to the fore after the Good Friday Agreement and is part, some might see, of the culture war of Northern Ireland, but some might also see it as part of the cultural reawakening and exploration of a post-Troubles society. And in brief, Ulster Scots refers to the Scottish impact upon the province of Ulster, the northernmost province of Ireland. And while in many ways it's very similar to Scottish literature and Scots language literature, it developed in a number of interesting variations within Ireland, and often was not recorded or preserved or discussed in the way that other literatures in the north of Ireland have been. So there was a policy potential to talk about this material as an academic, but to also do things that went beyond the academic sphere. And this is where the impact came in, because there was potential, because in many ways not many practitioners were getting involved, but there was a societal need and hunger and interest being developed. So what we saw, the other thing I would say is that, like everybody else, perhaps within the UK, when we're dealing with what does impact actually mean, we panicked in the ref before last as to how do we understand this? What does it do? Does it mean dissemination of work, or does it actually mean adding value beyond the realm of university? And that was a struggle, I think. And I think one of the things that really helped us move to a stronger sense was practically having a dry run in the ref before last, in which we gathered our materials and gathered our team. And that, I think, helped us work our way into a stronger position. We were effectively working across three main fields in developing our impact. And there's not necessarily a sense that one came before another. We started off with providing access to the 18th and 19th century materials through digitizing texts which were vulnerable. A lot of this process comes back to really the way that I was taught as a PhD researcher, and subsequent work of how you focus on an archive and learn the personality of the archive, and then learn how to explain and share that archive with others. So initially our work focused on digital preservation, and very, very low tech digital preservation, in which we scanned poetry books which are long out of print. There may be one or two copies of these in the world, and we made them available online. And that was our initial way in to sharing this material. But it also then offered opportunities that we could share this material in workshops with schools, in talks within the community. And because there was a broadcast fund and an appetite within Northern Ireland to present Ulster Scots material, language, literature to the media through radio and television and online materials. This then became a very obvious way of providing consultancy to broadcast firms and to finding the various ways in that you can provide consultancy. In some cases, it was discussing program ideas with production companies who then went away. At others, it was being assigned as the consultant on a program. So that allowed you to work from the pitch process, in which you supply some of the key information, to the drafting of script, the winning of funding, and then the working alongside the production company as both a consultant, perhaps as an interviewee, and then somebody finally at the end who sees the final rushes of the material to make sure that this gets the program through its funding loop. So it's actually a very complex and rich part of the process, but also quite involved. And this occurred. The team worked on a number of programs and continue to do so. The public outreach also came from what policy was driving academics and practitioners to do through the provision of Ulster Scots materials for schools. And we were very fortunate to work with the ministerial group and provided a very large education program. In effect, we designed, tested, and then produced a series of units within the GCSE and A-level and Key Stage 3 curriculum for Northern Ireland. So these provided ways for teachers and pupils to engage with the materials of Ulster Scots in ways that spoke the language of the education SIA, the Northern Ireland group for the curriculum development. In the past, there had, and with a lot of language and cultural activism, there's always a determination to tell government and the society that we require these materials, but there has to be some sort of foundational way of mainstreaming the approach. So we saw our role as part of that mainstreaming approach, in which we were not necessarily jumping up and down making intense claims for wanting to do things, but we're offering solutions through our work in what we did and how we achieved that. The public outreach at times was also small. I think sometimes with Impact, we're thinking, we have to go to these monster events. And while we, continued to run symposia and conferences, we also worked with the local festivals. So, and indeed, one of the best talks I did was within a pub where there was about 5 people sitting, but it was an incredibly good exchange of discussion and sharing of ideas. And it was in an area, because Ulster Scots itself is it's a volatile subject. It is not necessarily 100% accepted across the board in Northern Ireland, but to be in a place that people were kind of won over by the idea was very helpful at a community level, and very, very helpful to know that you get the invitation back again to provide that discussion. The one key thing I think to our success was the team in which we built to carry out this. We're a small unit, and anyone out there who's part of a small unit, I know there is that terror of how do we compete with others. Well, the best thing is to work with the team and to allow the team to develop and change over the years, and to allow the strengths of the team to shine, and to try and avoid a sort of one person impact case study in which you might have a bright shining light, but the team is not involved. So that was, I think, our one great asset, that we worked with the team and then allowed ourselves to kind of grow an organic network alongside that, because that allowed us to connect with people within our university who had fantastic contacts and allowed us to then move into easier acquisition of contacts out in the real world beyond university, but also the skills and ability of having somebody who was a professor of graphic design who could then connect us in with people that he had worked with as education officers, as heritage officers across the province. That this really opened up the conversations we were able to have, but it also enriched the understanding of what we were doing as well. But because sometimes coming from an academic background, it equips you to do teaching and research really, really well, but it may not allow you to fit into the systems out there in the community and the country that are often thinking in policy terms and thinking in ways to to make things happen. So that was very useful for us so that we could then learn the languages that policy was actually asking us to enact. The other big hint I would say that helped us formulate what we were doing is to go for projects and know that we were working on projects that interlinked and developed naturally out of what we were doing. It allowed us to be ambitious as well. I think having ambition and wanting to do the big thing. So we moved quite quickly, and maybe like Don Quixote, from the idea that we might digitize 10 or 20 texts to that we would go for maybe 100 texts, and we would be the group that developed Ulster Scots literature for education and broadcasting in Northern Ireland. Now we weren't expecting to be the only one-stop shop for doing this, but it soon became apparent that we had more reach and significance than we had realized. And this permitted us to really reach into other areas, particularly in local government consultation. As you're aware of the situation with Northern Ireland, it has been a fragile peace post-Good Friday Agreement. And as things occasionally would break down, this required local government and the civil service to continue with further consultation and further unofficial discussion. So we were able to contribute to that and then build up quite a good record of having the support, particularly when it comes for evidencing what we did. The awareness that you need to evidence what success you have, I think, is well worth bearing in mind. That we took it up, very quickly, and with the help of a good research impact officer as well that the university had developed for us. That you don't just record things, but make sure that you get good qualitative and quantitative data to underpin what you do, and ultimately to work within the language of the ref to outline that that we are doing the impact that they're suggesting is impactful. So we were very, very careful always to look at our outputs and our successes, but to frame them within what the ref was asking and requiring. And ultimately, I suppose that I finish up because I don't want to take up too much time. Expect and accept failure when it comes and learn from that. Not that you own it and you parade every time something hasn't worked out, but sometimes some of the things that didn't work taught us much more about the possibilities of what you can accomplish rather than the big successes. And the other thing for those who do very, very well in impact, I would also say, because I'm in that position as well, that either you pass on the skills and you share this with your unit so that you make sure that you bring your unit along with you, or that you sort of consider that you're going to continually be the impact person, and therefore you have to keep being more ambitious and thinking where you can go. And what I've discovered is that the impact that you do, if you do it well and it works and you see the results, that this can continue and you can reach different regions and different places. So ultimately, even if you're quite a small team, you can make incredible changes and improvements in the world around you from from what to some people are very basic materials. These are the old books sitting in libraries. But as anybody who understands the power of literature knows, that so much is based upon sharing the concepts and ideas and the power of old literature sitting in libraries.
Thank you, Frank. That was great. Thank you very much. Right, great start. On then to our next presenters. So welcome Jo Metcalfe and Catherine Wynne, both from the University of Hull. And they're going to talk about hopeful approaches to ex-prisoners reintegration, creative and critical educational practices. So thank you very much, and over to you.
Can you see this, Catherine, can you see the slideshow?
Yes, the slideshow is
amazing.
visible.
Do you want to introduce Catherine? Sorry, I can't see you now. I've got this.
Yes. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting us to this today. And thank you very much to Jo, actually, for asking me to join her on this. Jo is asking me here today in the context of my role as ref lead for the unit in 2021. And it's a role that I shared with my colleague, Professor Valerie Sanders, who I'm delighted to say is actually on the call with us today. And we helped to support and develop the impact case studies in our unit of assessment, one of which was led by Jo, who's going to talk about her case study today, and the second one that was led by our former head of department and playwright, Sarah Jane Dickinson. So I want to pass you over to Jo, who did extraordinary work right up to the deadline on developing this impact case study. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit more broadly about how it fitted within our remit and our understanding of who we are in Hull and the types of work that we do. So over to you, Jo.
Catherine, thank you. Frank, I loved hearing about your work, by the way, the archival work, the curriculum development. I love the idea that we're here today, like Linda said, to celebrate this range of impact work in the English unit of assessment. But it was interesting, Frank, because you said about being ambitious as well. You said about, I think you said expecting and accepting failure, but the fact we can also be ambitious as well. So I like this idea that we're here to celebrate being ambitious in our impact work as well. So I'm just going to run through a few slides, if I may. Sorry, there's quite a lot of information on them, but I can always share them afterwards. And obviously this is being recorded. But basically what we did with this impact case study, we were supporting prisoner reintegration through the use of new interventions in prison education. And what was key in all of it was this idea that we worked a lot around the potential or the concept of hope as a corrective kind of pedagogical tool. Now, in all, when we looked back at the impact work that we did, we worked with the formerly incarcerated, we worked with current prisoners, policy officers, prison staff, and related professional practitioners as well, particularly in the role of prison education. And in all of it, we talked very much about the idea of reintegration. Now, just to give you in an absolute nutshell, that idea of prison education, what we did with this project in terms of that term prison education, we ran a number of kind of critical thinking study groups that always revolved around a number of literature texts. And then we did creative writing off the back of those groups as well. We worked for 24 weeks or more with 2 sites of formerly incarcerated people in Hull. And then we also ran a module with prisoners at HMP Hull that ran online during the pandemic as well, that again was based on similar texts. Just to give you a very quick flavour of the kind of texts we were working with, we looked at an incredible collection of poetry from Guantanamo Bay. We looked at the Shawshank novella. I'm sure you've all seen the film, but we looked at the Stephen King novella as well. we looked at a memoir by a man called Sean Atwood. He was a British man who was actually incarcerated in the US. And the reason for doing that, for using those particular texts, was to stimulate creative writing activities, but also crucially to stimulate discussion around the idea of hope, but also around related concepts to do, for example, with ideas of humanity, what it means to be humane, but also in terms of citizenship and what it means to be a citizen as well. So that's a very, very broad overview as to what we did. In terms of the underpinning research, then, Frank, you spoke as well about archival studies and education, obviously literature. This one was also very inherently interdisciplinary as well. Linda said at the start it draws on American studies, critical prison studies, criminology, creative writing, but really at the heart of it very much were these literary texts. I'm actually now based in a criminology department, but at the time I was in a department that was English and American studies. And indeed, very much the work that I'm still doing still certainly suggests I'm going to be returned with the English unit of assessment as well. But Catherine can speak more to this, but you know, we are all working in a very interdisciplinary ref framework now then. So the impetus of the work in part came from work that I'd done before studying the memoirs by Sean Atwood. He was the British chap who was incarcerated in the US. And I was interested previously in the Americanness of those books and why their significance and success as well lies in kind of the American component. This idea about the exceptional US system and why we should be fascinated with US prison systems as well. And I always remember one of the participants said to me very simply, well, everyone's got something to say about America. So again, that kind of gave impetus to some of how the project then and the fieldwork then played out. It also stemmed as well from previous work that I had done. I did a lot of audience work previously, looking at how people consumed street gang memoirs, some of which had been written from beyond prison once people had been released, but also some of which very much detail what it means to then be released back into the community as well. And so previous audience research had told me that we should also be looking not just kind of at the narrative arc of transforming yourself when you're in prison, but actually what happens to you beyond that as well, and what happens in the real world. I hate saying the real world, but you know what I mean. What happens in the real world once you have been released as well. So in all of this, we then looked with a subgenre of criminology that's called narrative criminology. And narrative criminology very much considers then how prisoners and the formerly incarcerated may engage with narrative to help make sense of their own lives. And this was particularly meaningful then for people who were trying to desist from crime, desist and desistance being a very criminological term about stopping reoffending and about the journey that you actually go on to stop reoffending as well. So in terms of the dimensions or the details of the impact and the different dimensions that it had as well, there were indeed what we called these individual learning transformations. Again, I know there's a lot of problems with the word transformations, but you get my drift for the purposes of this. But yeah, so individual learning transformations, and that's when we worked with the centres in Hull, the resettlement organisations in Hull. And one thing we did do was we published a collection of writings called Hope Walks By Me. I published it co-edited with Russ Litton, who was the tutor who ran the groups with me. There, we did a lot of work looking at the emotional confidence of participants have been significantly enhanced. So that idea about your individual experience very much came through. Several of the texts, as I've already said, very much addressed questions around reoffending and desistance from crime. And again, that builds from the memoirs by Sean Atwood, but also if you've ever seen Shawshank or read Shawshank, you know that just as much as it is about prison, it's also about the struggles that people face once they've been released from prison as well. So we did a lot of work looking again or articulating how and why reading and doing creative writing may help us, you know, confront, again, horrible word, but temptations to reoffend, and putting people, you know, watching people on that journey to desist. That book that I mentioned, the collection of writings that we published, Hope Walks By Me. What we did with that was we then used it to publish what were called ThinkLit documents. ThinkLit documents were a number of documents that academics were invited to write that were distributed at prisons across the UK during the first lockdown. And they were used kind of as guides or prompts. There were guides to doing yoga in your cell. There were guides to doing creative writing. And we wrote one based on Shawshank, and we gave excerpts from the Shawshank novella. And we used it again we engaged with prisoners through correspondence with those ThinkLits. If you're familiar with the prison system in this country, HMPPS has to deliver on what are called purposeful activities. So, of course, these ThinkLit documents, as they were called, being distributed during lockdowns in prison, provided an opportunity for those purposeful activities in cell then. We then used those ThinkLit documents to underpin a module that was also actually a wider module around these same themes that was then delivered by the University of Hull at HMP as a distance learning module during the pandemic. It was the first of its kind to be run fully distance learning during the pandemic. Okay, so in terms of evidence, sorry, I'm very conscious about time here, so I'm flying through this. But in terms of evidence we collected, and again, it was interesting to hear what Frank had to say along these lines, and how we have to think very carefully about how evidence actually then constitutes as impact. We thought very carefully. I mean, there were some very kind of classic, straightforward ways of documenting impact here. So the testimonials that we collected from people who'd been involved with the groups, but also the practitioners who watched what we did as well. But we did try to think a little bit differently as well. So, for example, we had one of the pieces of evidence was a publication, a short publication, a short pamphlet that we did. And it was based on one of the creative writing exercises that we'd done in a number of the groups, where we'd invited people to write a letter to Boris Johnson asking him to put more money into prison education. And it was an exercise that had stemmed having read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And we talked very carefully about persuasive skills and how you can put forward persuasive writing and persuasive narratives. So we ended up, the letters that everyone wrote to Boris Johnson were so incredible that we ended up publishing them as a little pamphlet and then documenting those. So we did have much of the evidence was kind of very straightforward, but we also tried to think a little bit outside the box as well. A few things, I'm very conscious of time and I want to pass back to Catherine, but I will just mention very quickly a few challenges we face. These are probably challenges that all of us have faced doing impact. But for this project in particular, it was designed originally as just an organic project. I think Frank used the word organic as well. But actually, you know, that's not a bad thing that it wasn't necessarily designed with impact in mind. But of course, it meant that when I originally applied for money from Arts Council, from Arts Council and British Academy was this project, I would have perhaps asked for a specific bit of money as part of that for evaluation purposes if I'd known that this was actually, if I'd known at that time that this was actually going to be an impact case study. For the purposes of this project in particular, it wasn't a longitudinal, you know, it wasn't a long-term study to see if people had actually stopped reoffending. So we had to work within very specific time boundaries. And then, as I'm sure many of you have experienced as well, and as Catherine said, we ran right up to the last minute, again, in part because it hadn't necessarily originally been planned as an impact case study. But yeah, so we did end up going right up to the wire with the support of Catherine and Valerie, who were wonderful in all of this. I will just mention very quickly before handing over to Catherine that does now mean for me personally that I am thinking very differently about my future impact case study work. I am writing impact and evaluation into the grant applications that I'm doing at the minute. And indeed, all of the work that I am now doing is very carefully building on what I did before, should it then be returned or feed into impact for the next ref. So for example, in many ways what I'm doing is very similar to what I did before over the past few years, but I'm essentially taking it global. So for example, I'm running a very similar version of that module, the university module that ran during the pandemic. I'm now running it at 2 prisons in the UK and 2 prisons in the US, and they're all swapping their work by peer review across the Atlantic. But again, this all builds on what I did before in the previous in the previous impact case study as well. So Catherine, I'll hand back to you if I may. Thank you so much for letting me talk. I'm sorry I've used up much of the time, but I think it's important that people hear from you as well, Catherine, if that's okay.
So thank you, Jo, for that. And I just want to go back to some of the points, and Jo asked me to really talk about how we develop the impact case studies in our UOA. And I'm in charge now of 5 units of assessment as Associate Dean as we go towards 28 delivery and for REF 29. So it's quite a daunting task, but I'm also getting a kind of sense of how things are developing at an interdisciplinary level as well, and how English sits within that interdisciplinary framework, because what we've seen from Jo's impact case study and the other impact case study which we developed in that unit of assessment, neither of them came from the strict discipline of English, although, as Jo said, literature was at the heart of what she did. So I think that's really, really interesting to think about how we operate within this interdisciplinary dimension as well. So just to briefly mention, our second impact case study had developed from an earlier impact case study, which actually had been submitted to the unit of assessment in 2014, not to the English unit of assessment, but to the drama unit of assessment in 2014. That, I think, was still 33 then. It is, of course, 33 today. And this was challenging cultural amnesia in marginalised communities, and that was led by playwright Sarah Jane Dickinson, who also had the unenviable task of being head of the Department of English and American Studies at that point. So we all worked collaboratively. I think it is useful also to say in this context, because what I see and I've seen in research leadership positions since 2018, that it is very, very male-dominated domain. And I think it's very useful also to say that the 2 impact case leads and the 2 REF leads in our unit of assessment, it was a female, an all-female team. So I think that's also important to mention. But the 2 impact case studies, as Jo said, Jo's grew organically. Sarah Jane Dickinson's was growing from an earlier impact case study from 2014 and developed for the English unit of assessment from about 2018 onwards. She sat at that particular moment in time when she was developing in 2014, she sat actually in the School of the Arts. So I think that's an important thing to emphasize. But I think the other thing to think about within that context as well is the types of work that Jo and Sarah Jane were doing with working primarily with marginalized communities as well, with underrepresented communities. And Sarah Jane was working with a longer term study with marginalised communities called the Not Knowns and women involved in rugby league. So the Not Knowns were communities who were finding it difficult to access culture as well. And so she worked with those communities, and she developed playwriting activities, not exclusively, and that's evolving into a project called Safer. She's no longer, of course, working with us, but her work has been taken forward into kind of other projects that will be developed also for, we believe, the unit of assessment 33. And working at inclusivity in sport. And at the heart of that, of course, is also playwriting projects, but also educational change. And there's a lot of work being done there with schools and colleges and sports clubs in terms of educational change, supported by the BSA Wellcome Trust Ideas Fund. So Valerie and I had we took on the role of ref leads in 2018. So a lot of that work that we did at that point was evaluating where our impact was. And clearly what we saw as developing momentum at that point were the impact case studies from Jo and from Valerie. So one of the things that I wanted to think about, Jo and from Sarah Jane, and that's what Valerie and I worked on. But one of the things I want to think about is how do we think about this in terms of our ongoing preparations for REF 29? And one of the lovely phrases that Frank used was this idea of the language of REF. And I think our understanding of REF as it's evolving and changing, it changed. I delivered an impact case study in 2014. It changed remarkably in 2021 in terms of data collection and evidencing, and how it's shaping now as we go forward into this next few years, into the delivery period of 28. And I think as a community, I'd really like to think about some of those issues around what engagement actually means. Impact is not going to be resting on the shoulders of just certain individuals, but it's actually now, and again, invoking the language of Frank again, it's going to be very much about a team effort. and how we build, pass on, develop, and share those skill sets that we see today. And we've heard already the skill sets that have been developed by Joe and Frank in the delivery of their presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine and Joe. Great stuff. Thank you. And lots, as with Frank's presentation, for us to think about in our discussion. Finally, then, last but not least, our third speaker is Brendan Stone from the University of Sheffield. Welcome, Brendan. And Brendan is going to talk about his case study, Narrative and Voice in Health and Social Care. So, Brendan, over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks to my colleagues earlier for those fascinating presentations. I haven't got loads of beautiful slides, a bit like Frank, but I did panic and make one this morning, so I'm just going to show that one slide now. So hopefully you can kind of see that. And that those logos I will touch on in very quickly. Some of those collaborations and projects which are all linked together through the 2 impact case studies actually that I've been involved in. So now I'll stop sharing that and you can look at my face, sorry about that. So the REF21 impact case study, although it wasn't formally linked to the one that was submitted on my behalf in 2014, nevertheless, there was a lot of building and connecting between the two. I should preface all of this by saying that I've worked at the University of Sheffield since 2004. I'd just finished my PhD then. I was then, and I am still employed as a teacher and not a researcher. I think I'm probably slightly unorthodox in that. So I'm on what is euphemistically called a teaching contract, but nevertheless, I've had these 2 impact case studies, and the kind of core of the work that I've been involved in over the last 10-15 years has been particularly focused on how we can better understand exclusion and disadvantage in people living with what are known as severe or serious mental illness through using tools such as profound engagement with narrative, with language and voice. So all of the work that I've done over the years behind the scenes has been I suppose, a theoretical framework, really, drawing on narrative theory, but also on examples of narrative and the use of language in literature. Now, it all began really with a project called Storying Sheffield, which used narrative methodologies within the university. I created a course for people with serious mental illness from the city, and they did the course alongside second-year undergraduates, English undergraduates, everybody in the same classroom, doing the same things, and I think, hopefully, in a very accessible way, thinking about and producing narratives, which help to open up deeper and more profound understandings, I hope, around disadvantage, trauma, and mental illness. So those particular projects, there were several iterations of them. We worked with people between the ages of 18, and I think the oldest person who ever did the course was 80. People living with diagnoses of schizophrenia, people fresh out of prison and the secure psychiatric hospital sector, and many other folk too. So the work's really been driven by the idea of using the work for REF21, using patient narrative and the insights and understandings within patients' accounts of their own experience to drive better mental health services, to drive policy and strategy. It's also very much about witnessing and testimony, and for me, building communities which are based on solidarity, creativity, and mutual care. A very important link in the work I've done, a year or so after I started Storying Sheffield, I co-founded a local mental health charity called Sheffield Flourish. Do check out the website and give us some money. and we in Sheffield Flourish, we've come to utilize many of those narrative methods, and we kind of draw on the ethos which informs Storying Sheffield. You can have a look online at the many projects that Sheffield Flourish does. At the same time, I was working with my local mental health trust. First, I joined it as a governor, and then they commissioned me as a consultant for 2 years, in which I rewrote their strategy on service user experience and engagement. And to do that, I drew on narrative methodologies, including conversations and interviews with literally hundreds of people who use services and staff. My primary concern was to ensure that policies and practice were always being led and driven by service user experiences and priorities, and that actually saying service users is the wrong term, because actually a lot of people who don't use mental health services are the people we need to reach most, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But nevertheless, people with experience of profound distress, learning disabilities, substance misuse, neurological disorders, all of which we have responsibility for in the city, that the experiences of those people could help us shape our priorities. So through that, we set up a quality improvement unit, which very much is close to patient experience and tries to draw in that experience to shape strategy. I'm now on the board of the local mental health trust as a non-executive director with more or less the same brief. Through all of this work, I've made many connections and people have reached out to me. I probably also was a bit pushy in the early days. I'm not now. I say no to things, but so I was approached by the director of a high security psychiatric hospital in England and ran projects within an ultra high security unit for men, who many of whom had been transferred from life sentences in prison into the psychiatric hospital. And I helped to run projects there using narrative methodologies to try and help men understand their histories of trauma and also offending. I also ran a lecture course actually there, in which I drove eminent professors each week down to this ultra high security hospital to do lectures on everything from astrophysics to the history of French cinema, which was amazing. Alongside that, I got approached to do some projects training doctors and social workers using narrative methods, and I supervised it by employing people who were not well, living with mental illness, to basically run these projects with me in the background, making sure they were okay. So more recently, I was approached to lead work for NHS England on the reduction of what's known as restrictive practice, which often hits the headlines. Restrictive practice is where people in inpatient units are physically restrained, chemically restrained, and sometimes mechanically restrained when they are experiencing severe distress. So colleagues will undoubtedly have heard some of these very big headline grabbing cases recently, really quite shocking. And in that work, I very much focused on the narratives that we don't hear, particularly in this work, from minority communities. If you're a young Black man in this country, you're far more likely to experience physical restraint. You're far less likely to seek help until you're in crisis. And a history of exclusion has shaped, unfortunately, the experience of many Black and minority communities in accessing mental health care. That project actually showed some remarkable reductions in restraint and restrictive practice on the hundreds of wards that we worked within. Since then, I was invited to participate at 2 global ministerial summits for mental health, and I had a chance to speak to health leaders and government ministers from over 60 different countries, and had some input into the subsequent declaration, in which I was banging the drum about listening to people who know what it's like. And I'm currently just beginning, I was invited to take part in a new project run out of a subsidiary of the Royal College of Psychiatrists called the National Collaborating Centre for Mental Health. And we are working on a multi-million-pound initiative to improve the quality of inpatient mental health care. A much smaller project I'm currently working on, supervising really, which I'm just as excited about. It's tiny compared to that one, but I think it's amazing. And I can say that because I'm just supervising it. Is a project run out of Sheffield Flourish, which is exploring spirituality, faith, and mental health in minority communities. And we are working with a group of, I think it's only 10 women, looking at how religion, faith, and spiritual belief is absolutely essential to their maintenance of well-being, and also some of the harms that certain individuals experience from faith communities. Also got new projects running on suicide, commissioned by the City Council here in Sheffield, again, eliciting the voices of people who've survived suicide or have been bereaved through suicide. I found in the course of all this that PhD researchers have asked to work with me, poor fools, but anyway, they have, and it's a lovely part of my job. People who work, art therapists who work in prisons, music therapists who work with children who've experienced trauma, and profoundly disabled children. I'd say if I had one piece of advice, because all of this has just kind of happened, and nobody ever pressured me to do impact work because, like I say, I'm on a teaching contract. I'd say one of the most important things for me has been working with the charity. Well, first establishing and then working alongside the charity, because I can connect the charity to the NHS, to universities, to AHRC, and other grant bodies, and can help. And obviously they can help me too. Yeah, that's my ramble. Sorry.
Brendan, that was anything but a ramble. Thank you so much. That's
all right.
Amazing. Thank you. Big hand to our speakers, please, for 3 deeply fascinating and inspiring and immensely insightful presentations. Thank you so much, folks. Great. Thank you. Right, great. So we have time for questions and lots to talk about, I think. Who'd like to get the ball rolling? You're welcome to post in the chat or please raise your hand. This is always the moment. Yeah, Jenny. Thank you, Jenny. I was going to say it's almost the moment for stunned silence, but then thank you.
No, I've got it. Well, thank you all speakers for sharing these fantastic projects with us. Some of them I knew about already, others I've been learning about today. Absolutely amazing the work that you're doing. And I really love the care that you take about the colleagues who are involved, thinking about the teamwork, Frank, being alert to allowing for failure, for the ups and downs of recognizing the value of organic development and all of these things. It's just and indeed the work that you're doing with stories and people who are easily missed or forgotten, that is so valuable. But I've got a kind of quandary for everyone actually on this call. So I was on I'm on the Future of Humanities advisory group for the School of Institute School of Advanced Study in London, and we were talking about we have realized from our work. So we started this Speaking for English series because we wanted to share the amazing deep reach impactful work that people in our subject from language, linguistics, creative writing, literature are having. But one of the but the brutal truth is that when we're working with departments that are facing contraction, it doesn't matter how brilliant their impact is, if their universities are facing needing to save money very quickly. It doesn't really change what they're nobody wants to hear, it seems. Then we were on, I was at a meeting with the School of Advanced Study, and we were hearing from the HRC that when they go into DSIT to talk about the impact, that actually civil servants and government are really only interested in stories about productivity. So I just wanted to sort of pause over this and just think with all of you about how we might better think about how we can all sort of respond to that really depressing. When I heard that this week, I thought, oh no. I just, if I could just put that, you know, this is a moment of celebration. I feel like I'm bringing the, being a bit gloomy, but I'd love to hear people's responses to that and how we can really find ways to celebrate and get stories out there.
Brendan, yeah, and then Nick, yeah.
Well, very quickly then, just listening to Jo talk, you know, obviously I recognise the kind of moral and ethical drive behind what sounds like an absolutely wonderful project, Jo. I'd love to learn more. But if we were being cynical about it, and the same applies, I guess, to my work, you can spin this stuff because, of course, people are less likely to reoffend if they've had this kind of really deep kind of rehabilitation in a very humanistic way. And, you know, we hear a lot from the current government about the drain on the economy of welfare. I mean, we could have a whole rant about that, couldn't we? But I mean, lots of folk who've been involved with my charity and on the projects I run here have gone on to, because they wanted to, you know, get little jobs or do voluntary work and stuff. That's not, I know that's not why Jo does what she does, and it's not what I do, or what Frank does, but you can kind of spin it, I think, and sometimes we have to be politically astute and play the game. Sorry if that's cynical.
No, not at all, Brendan. Absolutely not. Thank you. Nick.
Yeah, thank you everyone. That was really really inspiring and fascinating to kind of hear all of your work. So I think to Jenny's question, I think again it's a big one, and I don't have an easy answer to especially kind of what happens when it falls on deaf ears, or kind of if only productivity is the thing you're interested in. I mean, let alone like kind of all the good work that people do and then gets kind of just overlooked in ref or kind of are in the process of kind of redundancies and all that sort of thing. However, I think there are some things from a policy perspective. So obviously sitting down with, say, DSIT or DCMS or whoever, that's quite a big ask if you're going to kind of go and give evidence in front of those kind of government departments. But I was struck that I think for each of the kind of the speakers today, there are, for example, like just things like APPGs, whether that's on mental health or kind of prisons or whatever it might be, various kind of cultural APPGs. They're not, you know, you're not necessarily getting the ear of ministers or the ear of kind of you know, the people who are really in charge to make the decisions, but you are kind of doing that very hard kind of, you know, slow kind of policy work that kind of, you know, and it just takes to kind of, you know, getting the ear of the right MP or the right interested person that might kind of help to kind of build stuff. So that I don't think there's an easy answer to kind of what happens when this falls on deaf ears, but I do think that kind of doing those little actions can help. And I'll shut up, but thank you again. Really enjoyed that. And I'd like to hear actually about your engagement. Like I'd be really keen to hear, yeah, whether you've had any of that engagement. Thank you.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much, Nick. Great question as well. Jo first, then Frank.
Yeah, no, I was just going to mention, Jenny, it was interesting, you know, that you raised this, and I don't think this quite answers your question, but just throws a few things out there. I mean, productivity, you know, obviously who gets to define what productivity is. And, you know, as Brendan was saying, productivity is so different for different groups. I mean, if I'm honest, I've had people say, you know, so what about your research? You know, so what that you're doing this work? Because I'm not doing grand sweeping formal social science studies of, and yet there's possibly impact, you know, in individuals' lives. It's very interesting, Jenny, because I did a project recently that ran creative writing workshops, and we actually did it with prison staff. So we did it with prison officers. We did it at two prisons. And we actually had a team of psychologists on board to then document the research in much more kind of formal, quantitative ways that I'm just not comfortable doing and that I've never traditionally done. And it's been really interesting having these conversations, because to me, creative writing is a data set that we need to take very seriously. And yet it's not a data set to the psychologists that I've worked with, who work in very different ways. So I know this isn't quite answering your question, but again, that idea about productivity, you know, a social science, you know, impact case study is always going to be productive in very different ways. But yet I still think we need to have, you know, celebrate and have ambition in what we're doing on this level. But yeah, so it's been very eye-opening working, you know, in a different department and in different ways along those lines.
Jo, can I just pick up on that before we bring Frank in? Could you tell us a bit more about the eye-opening experience then of working in different department, what it's taught you as well, how it's impacting on what you do, if you like, or what you don't do indeed?
Where do I begin with that, Linda?
Well, you know, it's a narrative.
Do you know what? This might actually be a question for Catherine as well, because Catherine's,
sure, of course,
and one of the reasons why we wanted Catherine to be involved is, well, I think it's important for Catherine to be here. So she was originally the research lead for the unit of assessment, and she's now moved into this different role where she's overseeing 5 different departments along these lines. Obviously, as Catherine said earlier, there's been this real move towards interdisciplinarity in impact case studies. And funnily enough, the last project that I did with the prison officer creative writing project, and then phase 2 of that project that we're now working on as well now, the 3 leads on it have been myself as a cultural studies scholar, a creative writing academic, and a criminologist. And when I say it's been eye-opening, it's just been in a whole range of ways, Linda. For example, not least, the ways in which we all treat creative writing as a data set differently. And again, I suppose you could say my criminologist colleague has been more open to that, whereas the psychologist that we had to do the evaluation for us didn't quite know what to do with the creative writing. Catherine, I don't know if you want to say a bit more along those lines.
I suppose just from my perspective that I'm seeing a number of impact case studies emerging across 5 units of assessment, and how much story is embedded into many of these UOAs as they're developing. And I think what we're very much seeing is the interdisciplinarity of it, and that whilst an impact case study may have come from a different unit of assessment, then migrated into the English unit of assessment, and then it's migrating in a different form out. And I think it really is the value of what we do, really. And I think maybe it just goes to the heart of the discipline, because everybody here is talking about literature at one level or another, the uses of literature as a springboard for change. And I still get very excited. Obviously, it's my discipline, so I get very excited about it. I think we can be more heartened by what we're doing. And I think it goes back to the question of productivity as well. I mean, why, I think we are productive. I think we change, we change in a smaller way. We make changes in lives, or we hope we do. I think we can have a longer lasting effect in terms of, because we make sense of our lives fundamentally through stories. I think all of this is important. And as Jo has said, I can see how creative writing, for instance, and Jo is coming to creative writing as well as something that you trained in rather than your discipline specific. That's correct, isn't it? Because you're an American Studies scholar and has sort of migrated into that area and developed those types of skill sets. And what we're seeing, an awful lot of what we're doing and developing across the various kind of units of assessment is the impact creative writing is having in particular in different units of assessment, and how that's working in different ways as well. So I think we've got a lot to celebrate in the discipline, and I think it goes back to thinking also about how we are, we as a discipline are going to actually impact on actually the next unit of the next ref as well. And I'm thinking how we can do that in terms of what our engagement means, and mobilizing, I think, our teams and our colleagues, and working across disciplines, but within a kind of a story English framework, and how we can immobilize them as well in terms of real delivery and showcasing what we do. So I think Next Ref has actually got an opportunity for us to really showcase what we do beyond the impact case studies as well. So I think we take the challenge, and I think we go with that challenge, and I think it's about the defense of the discipline, but it's also, I think, about seeing how important the discipline is for other disciplines too, and for the development of other disciplines.
Thank you, Catherine. Great. Thank you very much. And to Jo as well. Frank first, and then Anne, if that's okay. So, because I've had Frank's been on pause for a while, if you see what I mean. And then Anne, you definitely. Frank, over to you.
No, I think a very big here to the significance and strength of creative writing, and how it affects real change. And I think we haven't even grasped yet how significant that can be, and really, it's just wonderful to hear the work that Jo and Brendan are doing with creative writing, because I think that's one of the ways that we can really work within policy. Yes, policies always seems to be dealing with productivity, but policy is often generated by human rights and the underpinning of human rights to what policy should do. And I think we're in a very, very strong position with creative writing, and the very obvious change it makes in individuals and groups and communities and regions, when it's the ultimate flipping of the classroom, and that empowerment that creative writing can do. We've heard today how on so many levels that works. And it works within our discipline, but it works also to drive other disciplines who are in a very difficult position, because often the only things they can deal with are facts and numbers. And yet we deal with narrative and story and the human. And that is the core of so many things. And it's the core of being able to explain the STEM world to those who are seeking policy. So I think we're in a very, on one hand, we're in a difficult position, we're in a very challenged position, and we're in a very underfunded position, but we're also in a very strong position in terms of what we do as the core of our discipline.
Thank you, Frank. That's great. Thank you very much. Anne, thank you so much for waiting. Over to you.
No problem at all. No, I just wanted to say what an inspiring session this is. And in relation to Jenny's question, I mean, yeah, the cynic in me thinks if we included case studies on neurodiversity and the crisis of politicians, it might it might even get more attention, because very cynically speaking, all the projects being discussed were about marginalized communities, neglected literatures, and the sort of more advanced humanitarian angle. And yes, in the current climate, we can become very cynical. On the other hand, this session shows what actually can be done, and I think that is a very strong case to be made and continue to be made. And also with all the gloomy news that we are facing in universities, there is also sort of a temporal delay for us, perhaps, because again, cynically speaking, being mid-cycle, universities have a lot to gain to keep their impact teams going. And I know in some universities, at least, there is a recognition now that, for example, promotion procedures have to be adjusted and moved away from, promotion based on a very large number of high impact outputs to, you know, a more balancing act of one impact case study that is very strong could actually bring in more prestige, more profile to that particular unit than, you know, 7, 8 different outputs. And I think that is also something where we can be very, very clever. So we just have to keep going and hope that the political landscape, with all the cynicism we have, might change. And in terms of the team, I thought it was incredibly inspiring. And what I found particularly inspiring was precisely the way in which the project started, and the way the project started often were really out of interest and not necessarily meant to turn into impact case studies. And it was also really interesting that 2 of the case studies discussed were very much team driven, and one seemed very much you know, soul researcher driven, and I wondered whether the case study leads might say something about that process and how what the particular benefits or particular challenges were of the team-based approach, the sort of soul impact lead approach.
Thank you, Anne. So presenters, over to you, please. Who would like to go first? Please jump in. Brendan, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for going first. It's great.
Well, it probably did sound a bit like it was just me, which just shows what an egotist I am, doesn't it? Because of course it's never like that, ever. My biggest collaborator at the moment is an amazing woman called Shirin Tafori, who works with me on the Sheffield Flourish stuff. It's her who's actually leading this work with minority women on spirituality and mental health, and I supervise it. And over the years, I've tended to favour that way of working now, where I can maybe get some grant funding, and then I know there's some brilliant practitioners. So then Shirin is hooked up with a Black poetry collective and a Muslim group that she knows, and so often I think we can be conduits. So yeah, it certainly hasn't been all me by any way, but I probably did present it that way.
No, you didn't. No, not at all. No, absolutely not. Thank you, Brendan. Frank.
Yeah, I think really good impact case studies happen when you're connected in with a core of brilliant people, and you know, you have people who tell you what good ideas are and what bad ideas are. And the case studies that I've done have been team-based, because you're developing the initial idea, and the initial idea may have come from my research, but it also then, particularly when it deals with working with policy, that you require people with expertise and ability that goes beyond that particular initial idea. And it also, because these projects involve so much, the case studies as the ref present them always seem so they're so pristine and they're so lovely, but this has taken this takes 5, 10 years, 20 years to develop into that point of exchange. So everything is based upon, I think, knowing within your unit and maybe outside of your unit who to work with, because it is a combination of people and practitioners and institutions as well, particularly when you're trying to affect change within the school system, within perhaps the museum and heritage systems, and at local government level as well. So you require determined people who are able to juggle all those particular requirements, and also know that you're moving towards a point where you have to have a case study that shows that you have done what you set out to do.
No, thank you, Frank. No, great, thank you. Jo. Last but not least.
Thanks, Linda. Anne, it's a really good question, actually, thinking about the team. And with the impact study work that I was talking about from the last ref, it was led by me and informed by me, but it certainly had a lot of input from a criminology colleague who was a desistance expert. But one thing I just want to flag up and put out there, that last case study was also very much supported by one particular practitioner, an expert creative writing tutor who helped me in that project. And the more work I've done over the past few years, we've had more and more practitioners involved with the work that we're doing. And I just kind of want to throw it out there about how do we embed them in the team and give them the recognition that they deserve as well. It's always been very interesting to me, particularly in the last ref, that, you know, we have to think, oh, did getting them involved have impact for them? Did they get more work off the back of being involved with me? Whereas actually, shouldn't we be giving them, you know, more accreditation in terms of, well, actually they were embedded in the impact itself, you know, they were part of the impact itself. And also along those lines as well, I've recently been working with a couple of amazing PDRAs as well. And again, how do we give them the credit that they deserve as well, given that they might not be in the institution, you know, in the next ref and stuff. So I don't know, I just throw that out there as part of the team, that we need to think about practitioners as well. And I'm sure that's important for Brendan's work as well. And you, Frank, we were talking about the communication people, but also, you know, the PhDs and the PhDs and PDRAs we work with as well. Can I just throw one other thing out there very quickly, Linda? It was so interesting hearing you talk, Frank, about the importance of reading, the importance of creative writing in other disciplines. And Anne Heilman, I don't know if you remember, but the last time we spoke, it was about 2 a.m. for me because I was in California. But actually, it's interesting thinking about that idea about the importance of creative writing in other disciplines and the importance of reading in other disciplines as well. And I just want to say really quickly that I ran a book group with writing in it at a prison here last year, and then I took it out to the States and I ran the same book group for 12 weeks at 2 prisons in the US, one with female prisoners and one at a federal prison as well. But again, I can't help but thinking that in many ways, America is somehow a few years ahead of us in terms of recognizing that importance that Frank was talking about. You know, I just feel they're more up to speed somehow. There was a really interesting piece I read recently that again has very much informed some of the work I do, and it was talking about the importance of creative writing as a well-being practice for medics in the US, and it was such a fascinating piece, and it was that just made me have that moment of realization. So I don't know whether we're catching up with that, Frank, in some way, and whether we're going to get there, but whether it'll be by the next ref or not, I don't know. But yeah, thank you.
No, thanks, Jo. That's great. Fantastic. Thank you. What you were saying actually about collaboration and acknowledging everyone who's involved properly and rightly seems to me as well to feed in quite interesting ways to the whole piece around people, culture and environment. You know, the rebranded environment statement, for want of a better word. And I think there's some really interesting synergies and potentially tensions there as well that we're perhaps all going to have to be attentive to as we move further into the REF 2029 landscape. I don't know, but I think it's quite interesting because it's so important that you know we acknowledge contributions in a right and fair and proper and actually genuinely inclusive way. No, you're absolutely spot on. I will shut up because I don't want to speak too much. I want everyone else to speak. Are there any further questions? Okay. Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much, honestly, Jo, Catherine, Brendan and Frank, and everyone who's asked questions as well, got involved in the discussion, for a really fascinating, illuminating session. It's been wonderful. So thank you so much, really appreciate it. And hopefully, Jenny and Becky, a good way to end this series. Jenny, can I pass over to you, please, because you can tell us what's coming next.
Yes, I mean, this what I'm about to say will sound like an announcement, but actually it's really an invitation to you amazing people to help me think it through and shape it. So we've kind of come to the end of the Speaking for English. We've got everything recorded, and I'm one of many people I know who keeps dipping back in to really think about impact. It's partly because for the English Association, we're always thinking about new ways to celebrate and to actually to use your vocabulary, tell the story of what colleagues do. Anyway, so we're going to move on from Speaking for English to something that we're calling Thinking Forwards. We're going to start it from English, but we're going to move out to other arts and humanities. We're going to partner with Arts and Humanities Alliance, also with Crash at Cambridge, which will host events, and most importantly, the School of Advanced Study, who will host some of the work and the recordings, things that we learn about from across arts and humanities. So we're trying to move in step with our fellow disciplines. But the idea behind that is to really think about where humanities is going over the next decade or so and longer, and to try and shape that too. Think about, well, you're all doing it, but the kind of challenges we address, the solutions we provide, all of that. And in fact, it's actually really inspired by many of the impact case studies we've heard about and I've been reading. But we're going to start with, and this actually, Catherine, this speaks, I wrote this down, what you said, it speaks so directly to what you said, but seeing how important the discipline of English in all of its breadth is for other disciplines. And so with that in mind, we're going to start with, we're going to see this as a multi-year project. We're going to start with collaboration, the idea of collaboration. What does collaboration mean from an arts and humanities perspective, and what does this involve? And I'm particularly in it. It's, you know, you may get an email from me kind of knocking on your virtual door again. So we're going to start with Zoom meetings a bit like this before we move into have a big conference in Crash. But I really want people who've got interdisciplinary projects to come and join us. And I've been collecting them, collecting people's names, but I particularly want the scientists and the medics and the clinicians to speak up about what they get from working with us, to be able to tell that story much more clearly. If you've got any thoughts, or if you want to be part of that work, help me shape it. You know, I'm not owning it. We're just trying to start it. I'd love to hear from you. I see you as the experts in this, so thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jenny. That's wonderful. Great. Becky, over to you. Or would you like me to? I'm happy to close the session. So it's 22 minutes past 2. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been great. Thank you. Really inspiring, really encouraging as well. And a great way to look forward to the future too. So thank you so much. Have a lovely afternoon and have a great weekend. And thank you once again. See you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.